Okay, welcome everyone to the Econ Playground. Today I have with me Caleb Pettit, who's probably the modal guest on this channel so far, but I'm here with him for a special occasion. One, he's just finished his PhD at George Mason University with a thesis on what's the title of the thesis exactly?
The political economy of early modern England and her colonies.
Okay, fantastic. And I think, and this is something that I want to do a little bit more going forward, just basically have a general open invitation to anyone that finishes their PhD at Mason and wants like an hour and a half space to just broadcast what the topic and content of their dissertation was. And so Caleb's a great first pick for that. I'll probably restrict that to people who got their dissertation at GMU after myself, just so that there's a binding constraint on that, so I'm not flooded with requests, assuming I'll be flooded with requests, of course. But how about you give us a basic overview of the dissertation and how the different papers in it hold together? Because you have a little bit more of a coherent theme than a lot of other dissertations today tend to have.
Mhm. Yeah, so the main thing that binds everything together is the kind of topic that I'm hitting. So it is broad in that I do both like history of thought and then historical political economy. I'm looking both at England and America, but I'm looking at England and America in the early modern period, so 16th, 17th century, really. And then it's all dealing with trade and regulation, taxes, that kind of thing. So I'm looking at how uh, that basically various trade issues or regulations um, had their effect in the 17th and 18th century. And do you want me to just go through a brief overview of each of the chapters?
Maybe like one or two sentences about each, and then we'll
Yeah,
go in detail in each of them.
yeah. So the first one is history of thought piece looking at Adam Smith's beliefs about the Navigation Acts, which are 17th to 18th century British trade regulations. The second chapter is on interjurisdictional competition in the American colonies and how that affected tax rates. And the third chapter is on the incidence of the Molasses Act bribe. We can
Okay.
get more into that.
Okay, yeah, and so this is all in a period right before the American Revolution, right? So you're not
Yes.
dealing with post-revolution America, but there are a lot of things that clearly play into the revolution and then characterize American political economy, both domestic and foreign, in her independence. Okay, so the first passage, from my understanding, this is the first topic you got into in this area, right? Or this
Yeah.
is the first particular thing that you got into in this general area of British American colonial taxation. So, what were the Navigation Acts, and why did Adam Smith hate them so much, or why did Adam Smith like them so much, or what? Which one is it?
Yeah. So the Navigation Acts are trade regulations in England, mainly used in 17th and 18th century, and they cover two main areas. One is regulating England's trade with Europe, and so the way it does that, it has a combination of a few points, but basically they add up to outlawing countries engaging in the carrying trade with England. So the carrying trade is one country, say Holland, carrying goods from Poland to Portugal. So it's a country carrying goods that weren't produced in their country to a country that's also not their country. And so they basically outlaw that. That's mainly directed against the Dutch Republic. And then the other part is regulating the colonial trade with their colonies, primarily um, the North American colonies, both the 13 that we usually think about, and then also the West Indies and the Caribbean. And so those basically gave England a monopoly on imports and exports, at least for a certain set of enumerated specified commodities.
Hmm.
And
And then,
then
yeah.
and then Smith was against the Navigation Acts, is my big takeaway. It's not the common takeaway from what people have when they read Wealth of Nations. So I am kind of uh, almost alone in this. There's one other person who's done a little bit to try to show that Smith maybe was not in favor of the Navigation Acts, but I think as far as I'm aware, I have the most comprehensive study trying to show show that. And Smith is very openly against the navigation acts as they relate to colonial trade. So that's pretty well established in the literature. But when people say that Smith supported the navigation acts, they're particularly talking about the navigation acts as they relate to Europe. And so what I try to show is Smith has undermining remarks that basically add up to the idea that Smith did not support them. I don't have this actually in the chapter, but if I get a chance to revise it, my goal would be to kind of make two kind of tiered claims. The one that I'm very certain about is that Smith did not think that the navigation acts, as relating to European trade, did not think that they increased England's defensive capabilities, which was the point that people think Smith supported them on, and that they were outdated. And so I can show that pretty clearly in the text. And then the point that's a little bit harder to substantiate is that he was against them on like a theoretical basis. And I try to basically pull together as much evidence as I can for that. But that's a little bit harder to show just because um, it's a little bit more of an ambiguous claim. But I think that the first claim is very well supported in the text.
Okay, but if so many people are against you, why do you think that is? Like, so there are particular passages in Smith that seem to very much lend towards his support for the Navigation Act. So can you point us towards some of those?
Yeah, so there are three. There are three lines in Wealth of Nations where he makes claims that on their face sound very much in support of the navigation acts.
Hmm.
The first is when he's introducing the passages where they all show up are in book 4, chapter 2, which is on restrictions to international trade. Show up about halfway through when he starts giving out exceptions to his principle of free trade. The first one that he gives is defense, and then he says that the navigation acts are basically an example of regulations to free trade on the basis of defense, and that they properly endeavor to uh, give England a monopoly on the sailors and shipping of our home country. So that's the first one. The second is he says that their aim is wise, as if dictated by the most perfect wisdom is close to an exact quote, but not exactly there. And then the third is he says that they are the wisest of all commercial regulations.
Hmm.
And so those are the three kind of points that he makes in the last statement that comes right after Smith says that the navigation acts are bad for British opulence, but as defense is more important than opulence. And
Right.
so I get into that in the paper, but those are the three main claims that people will cite and point to when they try to show that Smith supported the navigation acts.
Right. So if your claim that you or we're saying is the maybe the weaker one that's you're certainly much more certain about, right? That is that the Navigation Acts did not improve Britain's military position, right? Then he seems to almost be contradicting himself there, or not really directly contradicting himself there. He's more just stating a general rule that defense is more important than opulence, which most people can agree with in the sense that defense is a critical input into opulence, right? Um, but so what suggests to you that Smith says all this, but then doesn't think that the Navigation Acts actually supported British defense capabilities?
Yeah. So first, I'll talk about why these statements are a little bit less um, strong claims than people will make them out to be. Is the first two claims he talks about their aim and what they endeavor to do, not what they actually did. And so those suggest that Smith might agree with their end goal of increasing defense, but he's not actually saying that they worked, not actually
Mm.
saying that they played out, that they were executed properly. And then the third claim is that they're the wisest of all commercial regulations. But anyone who's read The Wealth of Nations knows that Smith hates
Yeah.
commercial regulations, and so saying that it's the least bad of a really bad thing is not really um, like ringing endorsement and sounds pretty sarcastic, ironic, backhanded.
Yeah. It would be
Um,
like this a saint saying this is the least among sins or
yeah,
something like that, you know.
yeah, something like that. Is the best way to get shot, or like, not not ringing endorsements.
Yeah.
But then what kind of tips things in favor the other way? When Smith is introducing the navigation acts, he breaks them down into four parts. The first part is dealing with the colonial trade. He's very openly against that, so that's not something that I really need to touch. But then the next three things that he gives, as being the principal dispositions of the acts, uh, are things that Holland is the um, primary executor of in Europe. So it's dealing with being like an emporium for Europe, being the main exporter of fish and fish products, and one other thing. But basically, they amount to, these are aimed against the Dutch. And then he notes that the Dutch are still the principal carriers out of this trade. And so basically, right there in the text, he's saying these are targeted against the Dutch, but the Dutch are still doing fine in these branches of trade. And
Mhm.
so that's one thing that suggests he doesn't think that they work.
Similar,
He
I guess that would be similar to the idea that, well, not to get into it too fast, but in recent politics, a lot of the tariffs on China were with the putative goal that, well, if America is most of the import market for China, or most of the export market for China, right?
Mhm.
Then if we impose tariffs on China, taxing that, then they will lose a lot of revenue, or they'll lose a lot of productivity, or they'll lose a lot of demand for their products. Whereas it seems like in this intermediate period, which maybe as of this morning is changing, right? With the morning that we record this, maybe changing, it seems like China was able to pivot to a lot of other partners in Southeast Asia or different parts of the globe, right? So
Yeah,
the China being Holland in this case, right, and America being Britain.
yeah. But basically, the British are overestimating their ability to manipulate the Dutch trade.
Hmm.
And their main goal is to usurp the Dutch trade through this, because Smith talks about it in Wealth of Nations as well. But the idea that there's something unique about the carrying trade that is good for developing maritime capital. And so, even before he talks about the navigation acts, he um, criticizes this idea that the carrying trade is anything special in particular. And so that also cuts against the idea that the kind of theoretical underpinnings that were used for the navigation acts. In his
Hmm.
discussion on the navigation acts, he brings up the fact that they were passed out of animosity against the Dutch, at a time that was leading up to war. And so he acknowledges the role that they play in sparking the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And then later on, he circles back around to that idea, and says that the success of England in the wars that she had, couldn't have been due to the navigation acts because they were passed too soon. Um, he talks about the first two. He doesn't talk about the third. The third goes terribly for England against the Dutch. The
Hmm.
second one ends terribly for the Dutch as well. The idea of it
But for
crippling
the
the
British, it ends terribly for the
it
British.
and terribly
Yeah.
for the British. Yes, correct.
Okay.
He the point of the Navigation Acts to undermine the Dutch would be to undermine their maritime capital, which would undermine their ability to produce a navy.
Hmm.
But then he talks about the reason why the Dutch Navy today, or at the time of his writing, was so much less than England's, wasn't because of the diminution of her maritime capital. He says that if their navy had grown in proportion to their merchant fleet, they would still be like on par with England, essentially. So he basically criticizes all the avenues that the navigation acts would have for working, basically
Hmm.
for England. And then unspoken, um, directly, but he does say that the Dutch were at that time, the time of the passing of the Navigation Acts, the principal threat to England. And he never follows through on the idea of, are they still? But if you do any kind of basic look at the history of conflict between of that England had in Europe through the next century. Um, After the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which he again said they didn't work for, um, England and Holland are allies or neutral towards each other until um, the 1780s when Holland England starts attacking Holland for trading with the rebelling colonies. But they're at peace. The Dutch actually play a principal role in securing the Glorious Revolution.
Mhm.
The French are the main adversary for England up through the Napoleonic era, and the French have the next largest navy, and then after them, the Spanish. So the Dutch are not a threat for most of the time that the navigation acts are in place. And so
Mhm.
they're outdated in that sense, in which they're a targeted defense policy, not like a general defense policy, but specifically designed to undermine the Dutch. And by 1689, the Dutch are their allies and are important for their defense as opposed to a threat to the defense. And so it's an incoherent um, set of defense policies.
Yeah, and so at minimum, let's even say that they worked in diminishing Dutch military capacity. What it has is Dr. Klein has this book called The Half-Life of Policy Rationales, where okay, perhaps a policy or an intervention in the market makes sense in 1660, right? But over time, as conditions change, since the justness of that policy is so particular to time and place, right? As time and place shift, the way that policy gets set does not update with that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but in reading Smith, do you think you learned anything about how to read Smith because esoterically? Because sometimes people talk about
Mhm.
reading between the lines of Smith or other thinkers of his time or before, right? So are you doing an esoteric reading, and how does one go about doing things like that? Or is actually Smith quite straightforward, and all of these scholars before have just missed the obvious?
It depends on what day you ask me. So
Okay.
I've gone back and forth during my defense. The biggest thing that we talked about for this chapter was, is Smith being esoteric? Is he more clear? What's the motivation behind all this? Um, I think I think he might be esoteric. Dr. Klein certainly thinks so, but I think some of this is more clear. The points that he makes about the Dutch, I think that people would get that pretty quickly. And so I think that's a lot more undermining and would have been more obvious to people. And I'm actually kind of surprised at how long it's taken both me to realize the importance of Anglo-Dutch relations to talk about this and
Mhm.
how that really hasn't been addressed in the literature at all.
Mhm.
But Smith is very clear about it being principally affecting the Dutch and not working against the Dutch. And so I think if you come in with a frame of mind that's looking for something like that, it's pretty apparent. But if you're 300 years removed, 400 years removed from Anglo-Dutch politics, um, it might slide past you. But so I think there's some kind of openness, but I think that if it's not esotericism, Smith is definitely playing with the reader. He's not being direct and forthright, and I've thought about why that would be. But I think the answer would be the navigation acts as they relate to Europe, principally the Dutch, um, are outdated, and no one is really talking about them in the time that Smith is writing Wealth of Nations. When they're talking about the navigation acts, they're talking about how they relate to the colonies. And so um, basically the idea would be if Smith is being esoteric and guarded here, which he probably is to some extent, his goal is to not throw out the defense exception entirely, but when he's going to attack the navigation acts, he's going to attack the part that matters to people. So
Mhm.
he's going to be a little bit more cryptic about the part that doesn't really matter, because if you don't pick up on his more cryptic criticism of how it relates to the Dutch, that's fine because no one really cares about that. The Dutch have gotten around it decently fine. And so that's all well and good. But at the time he's writing, the colonies are in open revolt. People are trying to figure out what they're going to do with this lost revenue. Smith talks about the problem with the navigation acts as they relate to the colonies is that they have made England rely much more heavily on a single source of trade revenue.
Yeah.
And so now that the colonies are leaving, people are panicking. So it's actually become this source of a defense weakness where they're particularly reliant on a single country for trade and for revenue. And now those colonies are breaking away, and so there's concern about sources of revenue, sources of inputs for their production, and so it's much more important for him to hammer home the idea that the navigation acts were bad if they're related to the colonies, because
Hmm.
13 colonies are revolting, but they still have other colonies in the West Indies, and um, they're they've got holdings in India with the East India Trading Company, and so there's colonial holdings that are still regulated by the navigation acts that he needs to address, and those are the things that are prescient on people's minds. And so I think that that is the main esoteric or literary device, not literary device, but rhetorical move that he's making is obscuring any kind of antipathy that he has towards um, the European trade part of the navigation acts, so that he can openly defend attack the colonial trade part of the navigation acts and
Yeah.
get away with that.
Yeah, so from what I understand, what you're saying is it makes sense at the time for when he's writing Wealth of Nations for the section relating to the American colonies to be much more polemical and much
Yes.
more pounding the table for liberty, as Becky would say, Rothbard does, right?
Hmm. Yes.
But in the section on the carrying trade of the Dutch, he can be more reflective, and maybe even we might even accuse him of being sloppy with language sometimes, right? Such because
Yeah.
he's not so concerned with this with convincing people on this aspect, so he can have a more academic, impartial
Yeah.
spectator, consider all objections
Yeah.
way of talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then what you say too about the colonies, it's interesting because a lot of people talk about protectionism or having our production be domestic or at least within the control of our nation and ensuring that all of our supply chains are within our political control. That's an example of holding off against robustness. But really, in a sense, it at least depends on the circumstances, or it might be a trade-off between, well, if we are only dependent on one particular region or only dependent on domestic production for inputs into our production capacity, whether for defense or for opulence, I guess, right? It really does depend on these circumstances. So free trade might be more robust in more situations, in a sense, is what he's saying. Even if I suppose there might be some critical things like uranium today or whatever, there may have been an analogy to uranium at the time, that you'd absolutely want to make sure your enemies don't have and you have, or something like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's super interesting. I think in an earlier draft of the paper, I don't remember if you include it in the actual dissertation or not. My favorite line was where you said something like, Smith saying that the navigation acts were so good because they helped us win the war against the Anglo-Dutch trade would be like saying that the Great Society Acts were so good because they helped us win the Vietnam War, or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was talking about the involvement in the Anglo-Dutch wars because they steadily got worse, and the second one ended in terrible defeat for the English with their flagship getting stolen.
Mm,
And I go into it a little bit in the paper, but the flagship was built under Cromwell, but then was um, renamed after King Charles because it was the ship that picked him up when he was being returned from exile. So it's got this storied history. It's the second largest one in their fleet, and it gets taken by the Dutch. And so it's this huge, humiliating thing. I think there are still tensions between the English and the Dutch over the fact that they still display part of the ship in one of their museums. So it's a source of like great humiliation for the English.
yeah.
And so saying like, yeah, this is a wise policy because it's targeted against the Dutch, and like, so what if it got us involved in the Anglo-Dutch wars? Um, wouldn't work basically because everyone knows that those went poorly, and so saying that it worked, got US and Vietnam would be the same kind of thing, whereas no one thinks that that war went well.
Hmm. Yeah. So turning back again to not just today, but the last 100 years in America, the Jones Act is a particular piece of legislation in America that's affected our domestic trade capacity quite a bit. Um, that is in a sense has a similar defense and opulence kind of argument that people would are putatively why people think that Smith supported the Navigation Acts, or at least these parts of the Navigation Acts. So could you say a little bit how that works and how it relates to the way that you're making your arguments about what Smith is saying in The Wealth of Nations?
Yeah, so there's one important difference between the Jones Act and the Navigation Acts, in that the Jones Act is a lot more all-encompassing in restricting um, how trade is taking place with the US, and the US also has a lot longer coastlines, so things get a little bit more complicated there as well, which I can get into a little bit. But
Mm,
um, I think the Jones Act has actually done a lot to hurt the proper interpretation of Smith on the Navigation Acts, because the Jones Act and the Navigation Acts have a good deal of similarities, but one difference is that the Jones Act was a lot broader. The Navigation Acts originally were very targeted against the Dutch. And so if you think of the Navigation Acts as the older version of the Jones Act, then you kind of miss the targeted nature of the Navigation Acts. So I think that's one way that they've messed with things, but I think both have been ineffective in uh, building up shipbuilding capacity, um, and are bad for promoting opulence. Basically, it's somewhere in the neighborhood 90 to 95% of shipbuilding gets done in China, Japan, South Korea. I think it's definitely in East Asia, but I think it just might be those three countries. Um, and so they've invested very heavily in shipbuilding capacity, and the idea that the US is going to catch up with them through basically regulating the uh, having cabotage and restrictions on um, the coastal trade for America, so that you can have a foreign flagged, a non-Jones Act vessel drop off goods in the US, but they can't pick up more goods and then move along the coast. And so it limits our ability to benefit from foreign trade. Excuse me. And then it also limits our ability to get access to foreign ships. So you can't, it's very I think there have been one or two cases where, or a few cases where, the US has allowed the purchase of foreign ships, and then make them go through a process of flagging to get them to basically Jones Act standards, something like that. But that's also an expensive process. But it severely hampers the ability of the US to buy ships, and
hmm.
essentially makes it illegal. And so we have no access to considerably cheaper ships for our merchant marine. And so it's been terrible for US trade, US shipping, and there's not been an obvious payout in our ability to produce naval vessels, both military or otherwise.
Yeah, and it seems like the main people lobbying for something like that are people who do run the ports and stuff today,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But I'm kind of making this up as I'm thinking now, but it's the Jones Act was passed right at the beginning of the 20th century, and I don't know enough about, and maybe you don't know either, enough about the nature of naval warfare and how it's changing in that period, because from what I understand, maybe during those years, commercial and military ships are much more substitutes for one another. Whereas if I'm thinking like a big aircraft carrier, like a World War II aircraft carrier, right? It's not like you can just turn some shipping vessel into an aircraft carrier, you know.
yeah,
Maybe like one of those big barges if you do something about it, but I really don't think that's how it works at all. So in a sense, that's another half-life of policy rationale kind of thing, in that already by World War One or even World War Two, that legislation is not helping America's military capacity whatsoever and is actually dramatically undermining it. right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that actually starts getting outdated around the time that the Navigation Acts are first passed. So in
Mm,
1650, so with the first Anglo-Dutch War in 1652, the English start deploying ships of the line in the line of battle. And so a ship of the line has the qualifications for it change, but it's a large number of ship of cannons on its broadside so that it can project power from its broadside as opposed to putting guns your bow and stern and basically instead of trying to um, approach an enemy ship head on, use your cannons to soften them up, and then um, try to board them, and using that as your main method of warfare. It shifts to putting cannons in your broadside and then having ships line up bow to stern and then projecting power from the
mhm,
broadsides. Um, to be able to do that, they need these much larger and specially designed vessels. And so prior to 1650, it was much more common to convert merchant ships into warships and use those as your navy, basically. You didn't have a standing navy. But in the 1650s, it shifts towards the age of the ship of the line and basically makes the idea of converting merchant vessels into your navy obsolete for the most part. They can get used as smaller support ships, but
mhm,
basically, um, it starts becoming a less strong strategy. We also see it used to take a large number of people to man these ships, but as things have become automated, the number of people that you need to run your ships is considerably lower. So the British used to press people into service. Same for, I believe, America probably also did similarly. But either way, they'd be pulling from their commercial sailors and get them into the Navy in times of war. But at this point, the the U.S. Merchant Marine is very small, something like 12,000 people, I think, and the Navy has almost 500,000 people. I'm not sure.
yeah,
I could be wrong on that. It's been a little bit since I've looked at the numbers, but basically, there's no sense in which the Navy is going to be pulling on um, the Merchant Marine class for sailors. And
yeah.
so the nature of naval warfare has changed dramatically, and so we still have regulations that um, made sense, but not really. But had made more sense in 1650, but are basically entirely outdated in the 21st century.
Hmm. Okay, well, let's move on to the next chapter, which also relates to America and Atlantic trade, but in this case, much more trade of persons, right? No, well, that is not slavery. Well, a little bit slavery, slavery as well as voluntary settlement or indentured servitudes moving in the U.S. So why don't you give us the basic thesis of the second chapter on interjurisdictional competition and the American colonies?
Yeah, so basically the idea is just pulling from Tibu's model of interjurisdictional competition, where um, jurisdictions are competing with each other over people, and this produces more efficient outcomes.
Hmm.
Um, Basically, what I show is lawmakers had an incentive to engage in interjurisdictional competition, so those pressures would have been active at the time. And so then I show that that's the case. I show that population growth patterns follow what you would expect during um, in a situation of interjurisdictional competition being active. And then I show that there's a downward pressure on tax rates because of interjurisdictional competition, and then that the lawmakers also engage in some forms of non-tax or non-general rules curtailing to engage in interjurisdictional competition. That would be by advertising and by giving selective incentives for migration.
Okay, so what were some of these selective incentives? So how exactly did they incentivize British or other settlers to come into the American colonies or their particular colony?
Yeah, so it can be general. There are more generalized or long-standing ways of doing it, and then some very, very particular. So one of the most particular that I've seen is Governor Spotswood of Virginia in the 17 teens, passed a law that said that if Germans settled in a particular region in Virginia, they'd be
Mhm.
excluded from taxes for 7 years. And
Huh.
so it's basically a tax break for Germans who occupied an area that was on a kind of unsettled area that they needed security. And so
And
the
there
people,
was there a particular reason he wanted Germans?
I have not found an answer to that. I think it might have just been that there was a reputation for Germans being fighting people. It could have been that uh, they didn't want Englishmen moving there because if they all die, it looks bad for Englishmen to die, but you don't care as much for Germans. I'm not exactly sure, but that's where Germana, which is a community college in Virginia,
Hmm.
but Fort Germana was named after the Germans who
That's
moved there.
that's like near Culpeper.
Yeah.
Oh, what? Okay, this is a little bit under the hood stuff. Caleb and I used to live together with another guy, Matt Fredericks, and he went to Germana Community College, I think,
Yep.
before he came to Mason. So, okay,
Yeah.
a little bit
So
of personal history there.
yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Um, well, okay, and what this situation with the 13 colonies seems to be very unique. Um, Other major European powers were settling the Americas at this time, France and Spain being the main other ones. The Dutch to a little bit, the Portuguese a little bit, the Germans not so much yet. Even in very small situations, the Swedes, like a lot of people don't know that Philadelphia was originally settled by the Swedes, right? Before the British came, British and Dutch started fighting over it, right?
Mhm.
Um, but why do you think that this process really appeared in the British colonies? Was it something intentional that the colonizers realized was happening while they set things up? Why did it not occur in the French and Spanish colonies, basically? Or was it an accident of history that led to these effects?
So I haven't looked at the other colonies, so my knowledge is much more limited. But my expectation is it's something to do with both how some accident of history and how political boundaries were drawn, and
Mm,
then some sense of geographical determinism. So the way that boundaries are drawn affects things in that the Spanish control of Central and South America was broken up into four um, large political jurisdictions. So it's a much larger space than the American colonies and fewer jurisdictions. And so, and then you've got the Amazon rainforest, you've got the Andes Mountains, you've got a lot of different barriers to movement between these different um, jurisdictions in Central and South America. And
mm,
so that would basically limit the ease of movement, which would be a condition for interjurisdictional competition, that
yeah.
people will have the knowledge and means to move from one jurisdiction to the next. And so um, I think that that is one thing that limits interjurisdictional competition in Central and South America. And then there's also the um, how much the colonial output is dependent on or uses slave labor. And so I think the interjurisdictional competition would be far less in the Sugar Islands, both British and otherwise, just because basically you're talking about um, a few select large landowners who are concentrated buying up land, and then they have a large body of slaves working for them. And so you have both small plots of small geographical areas. So these islands are typically quite small, unless you're talking about like Saint Domingue or Jamaica. But basically, otherwise, they're quite small. A concentrated interest of people who are both running the government
Mm.
to extent, but they're not really competing for increasing their population. They're not. Um, there are a few things I can get into it that would um, motivate lawmakers to try to increase their population, and those really don't hold as well in the Sugar Islands, in part
Mm.
by their heavy reliance on slavery. Um,
One other angle I'm not sure if you've thought about is the relative differences between the native populations in those different regions. right?
Mhm.
In that, from what I understand, the Spanish had a much more extensive and intentional effort to convert the native populations. And so the population of places like Mexico today, right, are much more a mix of the native population and the Spanish settlers than is the case in the United States, right, or in the former
Mhm.
British colonies. So it's possible that just that the that exact and from what I understand, also just there was even prior to Columbus, there was a larger native population in Central South America rather
Mhm.
than in the United States or Canada, right? Just like
Yeah.
per square mile, right?
Yeah.
Population density was much higher there. So when you get there, there's already an existing population to either work with or enslave.
Yeah.
So the marginal product of labor would be lower, and the incentive to attract large populations would be much lower.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not
Also,
sure. Yeah.
probably the
That might be worth.
relative
Yeah.
taxation scheme matters too. Exactly how they do collect taxes
Yeah.
very much matters as well, and the incentives of the local governors too.
Yeah, and so that's part of the geographical determinism for the Spanish colonies as well, is that they're highly reliant on gold and silver mining. And
Right.
I think Smith actually goes into the differences, but silver especially is what's coming out of South America, and it also is very easy to tax because you need large industrial centers to purify silver. So gold comes out a lot more pure, but you need, I think, mercury to
Mm,
purify silver. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's something like that. And that basically means that it's very hard to hide your silver output because your silver output is not very valuable until you've converted it. And so you have to convert it in these large industrial centers that are easy to monitor their inputs and outputs.
right, right.
So that's something that you don't have as much in the Americas. You basically have no collection of precious metals, and so you don't have anywhere near as much concentration um, in terms of where things are going in and out. And so it's a lot easier to smuggle things as well.
Yeah, well, one other possible theory of what the difference between the French and Spanish and the British are has something maybe to do with the ideology that motivates a lot of the colonization. So the story about, at least in New England, a lot of the migration to the U.S. was about religious persecution, right? So there's like
Mhm.
a unique kind of person moving to America, and even in the southern colonies, there are people going there for profit and for the hope of establishing their own little, not kingdom per se, but their own plot of land over which they're free and independent. So the kind of person attracted to the British and American colonies also is more likely to be primed with an ideology for liberty, right? So that's too hard to test and all this stuff right now and really understand to what degree the ideology played into the kind of dynamics you're talking about. But in general, could you sort of speculate on how important this process was, the interjurisdictional competition process was, in forming the colonies in the 18th century for both the founding of the American Republic, and then going forward into America's history and identity as sort of the land of liberty?
Yeah. So I think interjurisdictional competition has a lot to do with the um, love of liberty and absence of taxation in the American colonies. So some of the things that are driving lawmakers to engage with this is they're threatened by hostile powers, and so they need a large population to defend themselves. Um, they want to increase their population to increase their output because that's tax money that pays their salary. And then lawmakers are engaged in rampant land speculation, and land speculation is only profitable if you have increasing labor coming in to demand
Hmm.
um, claims on property. So if you're going to flip the land, you need higher demand for your land
Yeah.
um, after you bought it than before you bought it. And so they have these like very, very strong pressures to increase the population. And so they they keep taxes to a bare minimum and they try everything that they can to make their places attractive. So Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, um, maybe New Jersey as well. All do religious liberty
Hmm.
as a means of attracting people,
Right.
but
Right.
keeping very low taxes is among the set of things that they do, um, New Jersey was a tax haven for a while, was basically tax haven for a while. Rhode Island is it Delaware in the 10 years leading up to the American Revolution, basically had no taxes at all,
Hmm.
and supported themselves entirely off of the interests generated from a state-owned land bank. And so that the idea of owning a land bank and using that as a revenue generating tool for the state was something that became popular as a way of easing tax restrictions. And so
Hmm.
people have noted that the increases in taxes on the Americans by the British weren't that big, and didn't really warrant the kind of responses that they got. But part of that oversized response is that they're used to paying almost no taxes. And so even a slight increase in the dollar amount of the taxes, even though it was amounts, but is a significant like share increase of their income that they're paying. And they've also become very accustomed to being um, had a hands-off governance by the British. The British are trying to meddle with the colonies more in the early kind of stages of things, but they as the colonies develop, the lower houses of the legislatures get a lot of power. And once they consolidate that power, they have a lot of leverage over the royal governors that are sent there. And so um, the English basically decide for the period of salutary neglect to let the colonies govern themselves. And this allows interjurisdictional competition to flourish, but also gets them very used to a hands-off situation. And so when the British government starts to try to um, curtail um, their trade. Also, the restrictions on moving out past the Appalachian Mountains is a big hit
Mm.
for people because they expected to be able to speculate on the land, and
Right.
not getting that was a huge blow to them as well. And so there's a lot of factors that are leading up to the American Revolution, but interjurisdictional competition is very important for keeping taxation low, and getting Americans accustomed to that.
Yeah, and I also suspect that, I mean, interjurisdictional competition of the way that you're talking about it very much primes people for the idea that a system based on the consent of the governed is actually a live option,
Yeah.
right? It's actually something that's on the table, at least according to the conditions that they're facing right then. So to what extent does this interjurisdictional competition system persist through American history, right? There's still, in some sense, competition between the states. People talk about, oh, tax in California are so high, I'm moving to Texas or Colorado or something like that, right? Or something like, oh, I'm homosexual, I can't get married in Texas, I'm going to move to California. That's not a, Supreme Court decisions shift that kind of thing around. Or people talk about abortion access, right? Those are the more in-kind social liberal benefits, whereas there's the taxation, monetary, economic benefits that's competition between different kind of states, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
obviously, a
So
place like Delaware, right, has extremely low or if not zero corporate taxes, so that's why you see an abnormally high number of
corporate registrations there.
corporations
Yeah.
headquartered in Delaware.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, interjurisdictional competition still exists in modern economies and in modern America. And so those are really good examples of ways that it plays out in modern times. But I I think there's a way in which interjurisdictional competition kind of shifted west as American expansion took place. So, like the three things that I mentioned as big drivers of interjurisdictional competition is that lawmakers were facing threatening hostile power, threatening powers outside of them. They wanted to increase their tax base, to increase their salaries, and then they wanted to engage in land speculation. And so as the colonies become, or the states in the newfound republic become more consolidated and safe, they become more populated, and so you're getting less returns to labor. And as the land has been bought up and is being cultivated and is you're less likely to engage in land speculation. As the frontier moves, those kind of motivations move with it, and so you're constantly encountering um, various tribes that are resisting the expansion. There's open land to speculate on and high returns to labor out in the frontier. And so as the frontier moves, interjurisdictional competition should move with it. And so I think the nexus of interjurisdictional competition moved with American expansion. Um, it's kind of speculative right now. I'd love to do like more research on the various stages of American expansion to see how things play out. But there's room for a lot more exploratory research on that. But I think the the strength of interjurisdictional competition has probably dropped off since the 1900 the start of the 1900s with the closing of the American frontier, basically.
Hmm. And right in that turn, there's a lot of pressure to continue the expansion. So as soon as they hit the edge, they're thinking, okay, are we going to go into the Philippines? Are we going to
Yeah.
have to go to more war with Mexico or something like that? There still is that kind of pressure. So that westward expansion obviously was felt, in
Yeah.
real terms when it ended. Um, but we were also talking a little bit before about both of us are big fans of the Alchian-Allen effect. Big shout out to Rosalino too for the Alchian-Allen effect. He loves it.
Yeah.
And one thing that I realized a while ago, and then when you're working on this project, I brought it up that the Alchian-Allen effect applies to T-Boo competition as well. So if we simplify the situation and just talk about taxes, you can think of the tax rate in each state as the price you pay to live there and um, and benefit from their public goods and the various other private goods that are attracted to those same public goods. So less transaction costs, less the cost of moving. We'll just simplify it to the tax rate is the price of living there or moving there, right? Um, and so the relative prices very much matter because there's different geographic fixed things that we don't expect the law of one price to occur because not every geographic location is selling the same good. Just like we don't expect the law of one price to occur in the housing market in general, even if there's still competition pressures, right? Um, but what the Alchian-Allen effect basically says is if there's one broad base fixed cost added to all of the different units that are being sold in this market, the relative prices between different goods are going to lessen with one another, especially between substitute goods. So as that happens, as relative prices shifts, people should substitute more of their consumption into the ones that were previously higher priced, or at least this margin of competition is going to matter much less, right?
Mhm.
So if interjurisdictional competition starts to end towards the end of the 19th century, how should this influence things going forward? Because we don't have that same felt sense of interjurisdictional competition that I think you're talking about. I mean, the examples that I gave about modern day certainly exist, but the pressures are not that strong, or at least they certainly weren't strong when I was younger. Only really because of really radically changing differences between the states on social and economic policy did these things start to get felt.
Yeah. So like the examples that you gave were very good ones for things that would lead people to move. But then whether it's the effect of interjurisdictional competition is the question on whether it's motivated by the idea to attract people. And so seems like the idea of variation in abortion policy are likely given by the ideologies and political alignments of the various parties that are already existing within the state. And so it gives room for migration, but it's not motivated by the idea of trying to attract more people into your state in particular.
Yeah, but there
Um,
is but there is things
yeah,
like sorry, the California is Hollywood. This is where you go to make movies, right? But just the very basic land and labor costs in California are so high right now that all of these other states are offering movie tax credits, right? Or
yeah,
movie production tax credits. Like when I did my Virginia taxes this year, there was a line like, "Did you make a movie in Virginia? Like this is where you put the expenses down." I was like, "Oh
yeah,
no, I didn't. Maybe I should have though." Right?
yeah. So I mean, the effects aren't entirely nullified by any means, but they've definitely weakened. And so, um, it would also explain the timing a little bit on the development of the passing the income tax, where the income tax basically adds access this broad-based tax across all the states. And then once you have that kind of flat tax imposed, uniform tax imposed across all the states, then it lowers the cost of low taxation states to raise their taxes, right? And so this also, by weakening competition between the states, it increases their ability to generate their own revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're able to substitute out a little bit of attracting more people and into um, expanding their tax codes to gather more taxes because they're facing less stringent competition. And so, yeah, I think there is definitely going to be like a pretty hard shift that we see at the closing the frontier with the passing the income tax and all these things. And so I'm sure that they're related. And so there's uh, plenty of projects that can be worked out there.
Yeah, I think the simple one would just be to compare how states reacted in their own tax policies to the income tax, which I just know
Yeah,
nothing about, right? I mean, there's state income taxes now as well, obviously. And it would also be interesting to see, how they change the base of taxation internally to each state, not
yeah,
just the rates. You'd have to look at both of those as a reaction to federal policy. It'd be an interesting paper, I think.
yeah.
Um, okay, one last question about this paper is that it's all about settlers to the colonies, right? And so probably one of the most famous papers in economics in the last 25 years was Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson's paper on the different kinds of colonialism. That is, is it settler colonial or not settler colonial, right? So could you say a little bit how this paper relates to their thesis?
Yeah. So um it it relates in that interjurisdictional competition would play a part in shaping the institutions that develop in the New World. And so I've actually talked with Tegan about writing a paper that would be an add-on to the AJR paper, which would basically we'd try to find some kind of proxy measure for the strength of interjurisdictional competition for various locations, and then see if that plays a role in affecting um, institutional outcomes. But basically, like the AJR paper is saying that um, the harder it is to settle in a particular place, the more likely you're going to impose extractive institutions as opposed to um, having inclusive institutions, where inclusive institutions would be the kinds that would attract settlers as opposed to people who are there to enslave the inhabitants or to bring slaves with them, which
Right.
again is very similar to what we're saying, or yeah, we'd be saying is um, the presence of interjurisdictional competition should relate to um, their motive, their mechanism, in that you should have interjurisdictional competition in places where settlers' mortality is lower,
Mhm.
um, because then you can actually attract people viably. And so so yeah, you need low enough settler mortality that you can engage in interjurisdictional competition. Although the American Chesapeake and South had a high mortality rate for a while, but still maintained themselves by having um, indentured servitude as opposed to slavery
Mm.
up until about 1700 was when the shift went from uh, heavy reliance on slavery as opposed to indentured servitude. So you can still also have where indentured servitude is kind of a split where it's a limited term slavery, but then you're a free person and you're a settler at that point. And so it's kind of an interesting um, way to split the difference. But yeah, the mortality rates of a certain region would certainly affect the willingness of people to permanently settle.
Okay, so let's move on to the last paper, which is um, the shortest, and it's focused on the Molasses Act. So give us the basic summary of what was the Molasses Act and what are you interested in about it?
Yeah. So the Molasses Act was a prohibitive tariff on the importation of foreign molasses into the American colonies. And so it's a prohibitive tariff in that it is not designed to generate revenue. It is designed to keep foreign molasses out of the American colonies. But it's entirely unsuccessful in keeping molasses out. If that's their aim is to make sure that no molasses gets in, it failed. It failed because everyone was smuggling molasses into the American colonies. And so, in that sense, it was a failure. But the way that they smuggled molasses into the American colonies was by bribing customs officials. And the bribe rate was a per unit rate that got pretty quickly standardized for the American colonies at 1 pence per gallon, which was 1/6 of the um, on the books tariff rate for molasses. And so everyone has kind of overlooked the fact that this bribe rate would function basically like a tariff and that it will have an economic impact on
Mm.
the suppliers and demanders of molasses. And so I kind of spell that out and then look at the incidence of this bribe basically on um, American molasses prices and British sugar production.
Okay, cool. Um, and but there's this very strange thing that you talk about how there was trade between in inputs between the different colonies, so between France and Spain, related to the fact that there was low specie in the Caribbean. That means there's low amount quantities of gold and silver, minted by any one of these governments. So and that made trade very unique between these different colonies of the different European powers. So spell that out a little bit.
Yeah. So it's a combination between limited species and um, the fact that the sugar producing islands are monocrop economies. And so
Mm,
basically you're you have various grades of sugar, so there's some kind of variation there. You also are selling molasses. A few of them have coffee, but basically all the trade that's taking place is for sugar and molasses in exchange for other goods. And so that allows sugar to basically be their medium of exchange. And so that it functions as a barter economy where um, for they're bartering with the American colonists molasses in exchange for horses, staves, and provisions, which are inputs into sugar production.
hmm
And so um, I'll tie this into basically the stated reason why the Sugar Islands wanted to pass the Molasses Act, first to prohibit the trade between um, the American colonies and the French and Spanish colonies, but then they later had to switch to a prohibitive tariff because they weren't able to get the bill passed as a prohibition. But the given reason was the Americans are buying molasses from these foreigners when they should be buying molasses from us, the British sugar producers. But the British sugar producers were basically using all of their molasses to produce their own rum. And so um, they had very little interest in selling the molasses. It was more profitable for them given the fact that they had already made capital investments into rum production on their sugar plantations uh, to continue producing rum with their molasses as opposed to selling it to the American colonists.
mm,
So the reason that they give isn't really genuine. So the motivation behind passing this is twofold. One is they're competitors with the American rum producers who are getting cheap access to molasses from the Dutch, French, and Spanish sugar producers. And so they are essentially trying to increase the price of American rum so that they have a more competitive product when they're selling rum. And then secondly, both British sugar producers and other foreign sugar producers are buying their inputs to sugar production, the horses, the staves, the provisions, um, from the North American colonies. And so if they um, raise the um, price of molasses, that basically also means that it's more the tariff, the degree to which the incidence falls on the foreign producers uh, is the degree to which they will have to pay more molasses in exchange for the horses, staves, and provisions, which
Mhm.
um, would shift the flow of molasses from sorry, it would make them less profitable and they would get less inputs for a given amount of molasses from the Americans, but the Americans would also get less molasses for a given amount of um, their inputs after the tax, and so that would make it relatively more attractive for them to sell to the British sugar producers. So it
Mhm.
would basically make inputs more expensive for foreign producers and less expensive for British sugar producers.
Yeah, so it's one of these really strange situations where it's like it's almost feels like it's currency exchange, but the currency is also usable as capital. So
Yes,
it's like you're
exactly.
reverting back to like a prehistoric trading situation or
Yeah, a
something like
little bit.
that. Yeah, which is not the kind of thing that we expect too much to think about because even international transactions today can be so liquid,
Yeah,
that there can be so much cash use in something like that. Um, which when I was in elementary school, I guess like fifth grade, and we were learning like basic things about the American Revolution, they say, oh, tobacco and stuff, those were cash crops for America, right? Which brings a whole new meaning to that idea because I'm kind of just realizing this as I'm talking, that when they say something's a cash crop, they mean it's something that is much closer to a more liquid asset, right? Such that
yeah,
you're producing a lot of, and it's a much more of a liquid asset. I mean, molasses is kind of a liquid asset, kind of for obvious reasons,
yeah,
but horses are not, you know,
yeah,
like when in uh in my intro econ classes when I was talking about, okay, how about we when I'm proposing different things that could be currency, you go, okay, how about a cow, right? People need cows for all kinds of things. They're very useful. They produce milk. When they die, they can be meat, right? What would you not, why would you not want to trade in cows or have cows be your primary investment for their future potential exchange value? Well, because if you want to make a transaction that's worth less than one of your cows, you'd have to cut your cow in half and the value drops,
yeah,
right? So there's so much like interesting things about to think about this. This could be just very simply at minimum like a very useful illustration for classes like that
yeah,
in how that stuff developed historically. Okay, and you start the essay with this quote from John Adams where he says, "I know not why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in American independence." Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Why does John Adams say that?
yeah. First, I should note that basically every paper or book that talks about the Molasses Act or the Sugar Act has that quote as their
Uh-huh.
epigraph.
Okay, yeah.
So it's a very popular one, but it's popular for a reason.
This is like a
Which
dog whistle that you're in the
Yeah,
Molasses Act.
you've read something in
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
But basically the Molasses Act, I touched on a little bit that the original intent was for it to be a prohibition. But the prohibition had lots of support in the House of Commons because there was a large sugar lobby that had a good deal of sway in the House of Commons, but it
Mhm.
didn't have sway in the House of Lords. So the House of Lords um, refused to pass these prohibitions on the Americans buying foreign molasses. And so they changed the language to be that of a revenue bill um, for the tariff. Now, it's disingenuous for it to be a revenue bill because it was specifically designed as a prohibitive tariff, which would not generate any revenue. But they use the language of giving and granting that is what you use for a revenue bill at the time in British Parliament. And there was a rule, I don't know if it's de facto or de jure, but that if the House of Commons passes a revenue bill, the House of Lords is obligated to pass it as well. And so they passed the Molasses Act after the House of Commons passed it, but this had radical implications because it was the first um, revenue bill on collecting taxes from the American colonies from the American side. So previously, the British collected taxation through funneling the American trade through London, basically. And so the Americans had to sell an enumerated set of commodities to England before it went out to the rest of the world. That allowed England to tax it and then re-export it. But this was the first time that they were taxing the American trade of imports from other
Mhm.
countries. And so this was something that was that was new, basically.
Yeah.
But
And let me just interject there. And so, one major difference between that would be that taxing the American exports basically through London, that would be a much less distortionary tax, right? Or
Mhm.
that would just be that most things that Americans want to sell to the rest of the world, which is most of the way that they're getting their revenue, right? The most of them are
Yeah,
selling to a foreign market anyway. Um, that's just goes through London. It's taxed at some fixed percent, so you can basically expect it, and it's relatively certain, right? And
yeah,
it kind of makes sense, this sort of quid pro quo deal between we are your, colonial overlord, and it's actually a relatively low, price to pay for British protection on the high seas.
yeah.
Whereas this
And
this this import tax, it's much more distortionary in that it hits certain critical production processes and things like that, right?
yeah, it's distortionary in that it's hitting production processes. It's an expansion of power, and then that it means that there are um, tax collectors in the Americas now that are representing the crown. And
Mhm.
so it establishes more of a foothold of control from the metropole on the colonies. Um, it's Yeah, and then it's messing with these inputs. So it's this expansion of power. But the Americans respected the right of the British to um, tax their exports and to funnel their exports through or to control their trade basically through the navigation acts. And so the problem or the interesting dilemma with the Molasses Act is that it was passed as a revenue bill, and it passed because it was treated as a revenue bill, but there was opposition to it, but very little like resistance in the way of what you see with the Sugar Act in 1764, because it was seen as a trade regulation as opposed
Mhm.
to an actual revenue bill. And
Yeah.
so it's positioned both as playing the part of revenue bill and trade regulation simultaneously, is what allowed the British to get this precedent of this more expansive taxation in the American colonies early. And so it became it was the first, I believe it was the first act to get modified by the British when they rolled out the Grenville program, which was the idea of the British putting regular troops on the American frontier for defense, and then the Americans paying more in taxes to basically subsidize or to fund their own defense, basically. And they did that by lowering the tariff on molasses from 6 pence per gallon to 3 pence per gallon, and then increasing enforcement. And so that enforcement included the movement of ships in the British Navy to the American coastline to enforce this, which provoked all kinds of opposition. And it was the first kind of battle between the American tax resistance and resistance to uh, British intervention into the colonies, and the British trying to extract more to fund basically the defense of the American frontier.
Hmm. And so I mean, anyone who's familiar with the basic Baptists and bootleggers idea, right, knows that sometimes somebody who is selling a product wants it to be prohibited or taxed heavily because they have some particular advantage in getting around that taxation. So it hurts their competitors, right? So the Baptists and bootleggers idea is that both Baptists who want people to stop drinking alcohol and bootleggers who want to sell alcohol illicitly because they have a comparative advantage in selling things illicitly want a prohibition on alcohol to be passed. So there's this ironic thing in that that that's happening in the time of the American Revolution, where some of these acts, like I think mostly the Stamp Acts, are actually lowering the tax rates of certain goods that are being charged to American colonists, and the smugglers are upset about this. So is that to some degree what Adams is talking about? Is the fact that smugglers who actually preferred the higher tax situation were in some sense supporting the American Revolution, and that might be something to be ashamed about, but also these smugglers were in line with the more ideological supporters of the American Revolution.
So that was the Baptist and bootleggers idea was actually the plan for this paper before
Mm,
the version that came out, where my assumption was something like smuggling involves running from the British Navy, and so you want to have a fast vessel. So that means that you have like a particular kind of ship that is
mm,
holds less cargo but can move you quicker. And so you invest in this smuggling capital, and then lowering the taxes would increase would the smugglers would resist the lowering of the tariff because then their ships become inefficient carriers. I was wrong about that, and that's basically how I got into the bribe. But basically, the bootleggers and Baptist story doesn't really hold for this one.
mm.
Um they resisted the drop from 6 pence to 3 pence. Um, both because it was still a prohibitive tariff at that point. The 1 pence per gallon was basically what the market could bear. And so lowering it to 3 pence still didn't solve the problems. But it's also opposition to the Hovering Act, which is the use of the British Navy to enforce the smuggling rules, which was the first time that that starts happening. And so um, the fact that the the smuggling happened basically out in the open. They discussed the rates of um, the rates paid by smugglers to customs officials in Parliament, so people knew the rates. I've heard but have not, I've read about but have not found actual copies of pamphlets that published the rates for the bribe. So it was very open, and so the idea that you're cracking down on something that was de facto licit,
Mm.
um, is really where the pushback comes from in this case.
Okay, so but maybe and you can I don't know if you looked into this at all. Maybe that occurred more with things like the Stamp Acts that affected more tea trade and in New England.
So the Stamp Act was just a straight up increase in taxation that got shut down very quickly. The Tea Act, the thing that prompts the um, Boston Tea Party
Right.
is the allowance for the British East India Company to sell directly to the colonies, which
Oh,
would
I
have
see.
lowered the price of tea, but would have cut out the merchants who dealt with buying the tea from London. And
Uh-huh.
so that's a case in which it's not exactly bootleggers and Baptists, but there's a narrow interest. The tea merchants that are American are getting cut out of this trade, but the trade would have been beneficial for all American tea
Yeah.
drinkers because it would have lowered the price of tea. but
Right. So formerly, the East India Company was required to sell
sell
to
to
London
London.
merchants, and London merchants would sell to Americans.
Yes. Yeah. So it was basically the same deal as the Navigation Acts. They're forced to sell through London first.
I see.
Um, this would have allowed them to sell directly to America, which would have lowered the price of tea, but would have cut out the American tea merchants.
Okay, fascinating. Um, okay, so I guess that'll sort of conclude that paper, and I'll just give you one last question, kind of about this paper, but also about the entire dissertation, is just in what other ways do you see these dynamics, specifically about trade, the politics around trade, and America and sort of the American identity? Or that's a very broad question. To the things that are going on today. You can have 5 minutes to say whatever you want about that, basically.
Yeah. I guess I'll go in reverse order. So first, with the Molasses Act chapter, like my main point was that you have to consider the downwind effects of this smuggling, that it actually does have economic incidents. But another, the big takeaway that most people have hammered on is the idea that um, when you try to restrict something, producers aren't going to sit by idly and let it happen.
Mhm.
And you'll have a rise in smuggling, basically to get around it. And this has been a problem with tariffs in general for their entire history. Is you raise tariffs, you increase smuggling, and so we've seen an increase in tariffs. And I haven't read too much about it, but I know that there has been talks of smuggling becoming a worse problem
Mhm.
um, now that tariff rates have shot up, and so that's something to consider. Is basically there's going to be a larger market for illicit importation of goods to get around tariffs as tariff rates go up. Um, and then also that the point from this paper would basically be um, there are costs involved in that smuggling, and so even though that smuggling in a way relieves the average person from some of the burdens from the tariffs, there's still going to be an increased cost borne by people who are engaged in one point or the other in that smuggling trade. Um, the interjurisdictional competition chapter, I kind of hit on a lot of the things. Basically, the closing the American frontier is going to coincide with a diminution of the um, strength of interjurisdictional competition. Uh, but then there is a recent concern with the decline in fertility rates. And
Mhm.
so decline in fertility rates means that you'll have an inversion of
Mhm.
population pyramids, which means that younger populations will bear um, an increasing share of debt and responsibility for funding social services.
Mhm.
And so that will be difficult for those people. And so they will be probably more willing to move on the basis of tax rates and debt burden in general. And so, as states, both in the United States and then various nations, are facing population crises, they may have a much larger interest in attracting people both through um, local migration or international migration.
Mhm.
And so that could be something that causes an increased pressure for um, interjurisdictional competition, even though that does get more challenging when you've got a larger federal government, you've got a large income tax, and so that
Mhm.
has alternate island effects that we've talked about. But that is one kind of motivation that is kind of unique for modern populations,
Mhm.
where population size is decreasing. How long will this take place before states start looking for interjurisdictional competition to be the solution to the problem? So that's something to consider as a modern takeaway. And then the Navigation Acts chapter, the big takeaway is if Adam Smith did not support the Navigation Acts, or at least did not think that they worked, were ineffective and outdated, it takes away an arrow in the quiver of the people who are defending the Jones Act. Um, it's very popular for people who defend the Jones Act to point out that Adam Smith, the champion of free trade, supported the Navigation Acts, and so that'll get used as something to uh, defend the idea that the Jones Act is actually reasonable and it's a reasonable exception to free trade. And so saying that Adam Smith didn't support it is not going to be the nail in the coffin of Jones Act supporters by any means, but hopefully it takes out one of the arguments that they like to make, and hopefully it starts moving things more in the balance of people who are supporters of free trade. And so
Great.
that kind of ties it all up, I think.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And I think this is fantastic stuff. And why don't you just tell people quick what you're doing next and where people can find you?
Yeah, so I recently started role as a research associate at the Independent Institute. And so I have a website, calebpettit.com, where you can see what I write, but I basically will write for various outlets and then also do research assistant work for some of the scholars there. So I've been trying to write a lot more short form and popular stuff, both with Veronique de Rugy's Substack, The Unseen and the Unsaid, and trying to write more with National Review. I have a good relationship with them, and so I want to continue writing with them. But then I also send stuff to other outlets. But yeah, I'm trying to put more stuff out there, and so follow me on Twitter, my website. Keep an eye out for things that are coming out.
Great. Thanks, Caleb.
Awesome. Thank you,
Bye.
Marcus.